They say a man's silence can hide anything, grief, guilt, or even love. But the silence Boaz Cutter carried was heavier than words could ever hold. And I knew the moment he stepped into that schoolhouse, our fates, mine and his, would never walk separate paths again. They told me the prairie would be my refuge. They didn't mention it might also be the stage where my entire life would turn upside down. Before I begin, let me say this. If you've ever believed that survival sometimes demands unexpected choices, choices that feel more like surrender than strength, then stay with me. Like, subscribe, or follow along if this feels familiar to you, because what you're about to hear isn't a love story in the traditional sense. It's about a man too hardened to hope, and a woman too worn down to dream. And yet, somehow, the wind still carried something between them that neither expected. I was 33 the first time I met Boaz Cutter, 6.5 feet of solemn silence wrapped in a duster and dusk. He stood in the doorway of my schoolhouse like a shadow given shape by winter's breath. The late September wind howled against the wooden boards behind me, and the prairie outside looked like a sea of gold dying into gray. Inside, chalk dust lingered in the air as my students bent over their slates, murmuring multiplication tables. It was a day like any other in Red Fern Ridge, until it wasn't. He didn't knock, just stepped inside with his hat held respectfully in those massive, weather-worn hands, and said one sentence that blew through my life like a wildfire. I need a wife. Not hello, not how do you do, just that. I remember blinking at him, not entirely sure he was real. Up close, he was as unyielding as the land, broad-shouldered, scarred in places only a hard life could explain, and quiet in that eerie way only truly dangerous men can manage. The kind that never needed to raise a voice to be heard. His dark brown eyes met mine, calm as still water before a storm. And you, he continued in that deep, earth-shaking voice of his, need strong sons to guard your winters. If the children hadn't already gone silent, they certainly did then. I could feel all 12 pairs of eyes drilling into my back, waiting for me to send him away or swoon from the shock. But I did neither. I just stared at him, stunned, not because a man had proposed marriage with less ceremony than ordering lumber from the general store, but because for the first time in years, someone looked at me as if I mattered beyond my blackboard and arithmetic drills. You need to understand something about women like me. Women the world forgets after 30. We become fixtures, familiar and functional. The town's dependable Miss Wyn. No scandal, no fuss, just books and biscuits. But Boaz Cutter didn't see a fixture. He saw a use, yes, but behind it, maybe, just maybe, a person. At first, I thought it was a joke. Some misguided rancher's attempt to secure domestic help with paperwork instead of romance. But Boaz wasn't joking. He laid it all out right there on my porch, while the wind whipped through the cottonwoods and the scent of autumn clung to the edges of my shawl. I don't want a girl with stars in her eyes, he said. I want a woman who's known loneliness and kept going. Someone who understands the cold and how hard this land can be. You've been teaching here 8 years. You survived the blizzard of '86 and never missed a lesson. That tells me everything I need to know. I wanted to be insulted. I wanted to say no. But something in his tone, calm, sure, brutally honest, made me pause. He wasn't offering love. He wasn't offering passion. He was offering protection, partnership, and perhaps, over time, something softer. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the parchment he left behind, a marriage contract written in careful, masculine script. The words "affection may grow but is not required" stood out like frostbite on an otherwise warm page. There were terms. I could keep my job, have my own room, maintain my independence in public. In exchange, I'd manage his home and bear his children, if I chose to. I ran my fingers over the edge of the paper like it was a knife, wondering if signing it meant cutting away the rest of my dreams. But what dreams exactly? The banker's son who left me for a girl with a dowry? The family back in Ohio who pitted more than loved me? The quiet nights spent reading aloud to no one, warming my hands over a stove that burned hotter than my heart ever had? Maybe Boaz Cutter wasn't offering a fairy tale. Maybe he was offering something rarer, truth. And maybe I was tired enough of waiting for miracles to take what the wind was blowing my way. That night, I dreamed of fences covered in frost, of hands rough from rope and reins touching mine with quiet reverence, of a home that didn't echo with absence. I dreamed of being more than useful. I dreamed of being wanted. Not for beauty, not for breeding, just for who I was, sturdy and still standing. And when I woke, I wasn't certain if I had been dreaming at all. Because outside, under a sky full of steel-gray clouds, the prairie wind carried his name, Boaz Cutter, whispered like a secret I had yet to understand. But I would. The Cutter Ranch was quieter than I expected. Not the kind of silence that speaks of emptiness, but the kind that listens, like the land itself was waiting to see what sort of woman would arrive on its doorstep with a marriage contract in hand and a heart half wrapped in iron. The house sat low between two hills, shielded from the wind, yet wide open to the pale Wyoming sun. As I crested the ridge that morning, boots caked in red dirt, I saw Boaz already at work by the corral, sleeves rolled up, hands steady as he mended a broken fence rail. I'd only seen him once since signing the contract, and I wasn't sure whether he'd greet me with a nod, a kiss, or silence. He surprised me, again, with none of those. Instead, he looked up, that quiet gaze of his sweeping over me as if he was checking not what I carried, but what I lacked. Fear, maybe. Doubt. And finding neither, he simply said, "You're early." I told him I wanted to speak before the school day began. I still clung to my routine like a raft in stormy seas, sunrise lessons, familiar faces, slate dust under my fingernails. I wasn't ready to give it up, not yet. I handed him the folded paper without flourish. "I've made my decision." His fingers grazed mine as he took the contract, and that single touch sent a strange sensation up my arm. Not heat exactly, more like a grounding. Something real, like leather or stone. As he read through the pages, his face didn't change, but his shoulders eased the smallest fraction, like he'd been holding breath for days and didn't realize it until just now. "You're certain?" he asked. "As certain as anyone can be," I said. "But I have conditions." He didn't blink. "I expected you would." And so we spoke, calmly, like two people planning to plant crops together or split a homestead. I told him I would keep teaching, that the children needed me. He nodded without hesitation. "I don't want you to give that up," he said. "I'd be proud to have a wife who uses her mind." I was struck by the ease of it. How he spoke the word wife like it belonged to me, not him. I asked for separate bedrooms, at least for now. He agreed. I asked to be respected for who I was, not what he expected me to become. And that, of all things, made him pause. When he spoke, his voice dropped low, almost reverent. "Abigail," he said, and the sound of my name in his voice made me still. "I asked you to marry me because of who you already are, not because I want to change you." It was more kindness than I'd heard from a man in a decade. 2 weeks passed in a strange rhythm. I lived in two worlds. One foot in the life I'd known, schoolhouse, lesson plans, gossip whispered behind coffee cups, and the other already stepping into the future. A home not yet mine, a man not yet mine either, not truly. But he showed himself in little ways. He swept the porch, built shelves for my books, cleared a space in the parlor, and left a blank page on the writing desk he'd moved near the east window, where the morning light spilled like honey. I expected neighbors to come nosing around, and I wasn't wrong. Some came with gifts, others with warnings. Mrs. Henderson, the town's self-appointed morality judge, stopped by with scones and concern. "He's never looked at a woman," she whispered. "And now he wants to marry you, sight unseen." I smiled, poured her tea, and said nothing. The less I explained, the less they'd twist. But the children were the most honest. Little Tommy Fletcher walked up to me after class and said, "If you marry Mr. Cutter, will you still make us do arithmetic?" "Yes, Tommy." He scowled. "Well, okay. But he's real big. Like a bear. Are you gonna ride horses with him?" "I suppose I might." He nodded solemnly. "Good. Bears should have company." And somehow, that made sense to me. Boaz and I didn't speak of love, but I began to notice small signs that something unfamiliar was stirring between us. One evening, after church, I reached for my shawl on the bench beside him, and his hand brushed mine. It lingered. Not possessive, not accidental. Just there. A warmth that settled deep, like embers waiting for a flame. Another night, I left school late and walked past the mercantile. Through the lamplight, I saw him across the road, watching, not in a way that made me uneasy, but like he was waiting to be sure I got home safe. He never spoke of it, just nodded the next day like nothing had happened. But I noticed. One quiet afternoon, while boiling water for tea, I found his handwriting on a slip of paper in the kitchen drawer, a list of items he thought I might want from town: tea, soap, apples, written in that same careful script from our marriage contract. Next to apples, he had written for pies, if you're inclined. I made him one the next evening, and though he said nothing, he cleaned the plate like a man tasting spring after a long winter. So I suppose we were thawing. Not fast, not all at once, but inch by inch, like snow giving way to green under a prairie sun. And I began to wonder, dangerously, longingly, if perhaps a marriage begun without love could stumble into something resembling it. He never called me darling, never kissed my hand in front of others. But when I spoke, he listened. When I sighed, he noticed. And when I stood by his side in church, I felt a kind of shelter, like the storm could come and I'd stay dry, just because he was there. What he didn't know, what neither of us dared speak aloud yet, was that the life we were building, brick by hesitant brick, was no longer just survival. It was hope, and hope, once rooted, doesn't let go easily. The storm didn't come with rain or thunder. It came on horseback, for riders cresting the hill like shadows out of a fever dream, dust curling up behind them like smoke from a fire too long denied. Marcus Blackwood rode in front, calm and coiled, flanked by men who looked like they'd drawn pistols before breakfast. I watched from the front porch as Boaz stood still in the yard, sleeves rolled up, the only weapon on him the steel in his spine. I stood behind the screen door with my heart in my throat, and a pistol tucked into the pocket of my skirt. Boaz had told me once that some things were worth fighting for. I hadn't understood it then. I do now. Blackwood wanted land. He claimed old deeds, muttered about property lines and forgotten boundaries. But I saw the truth in his eyes. This wasn't about grazing rights. It was about breaking Boaz, about punishing him for building something decent on ground that once held grief and blood. And I wouldn't let it happen. When Blackwood made his threat, cold and unmistakable, implying harm if we didn't yield, I stepped forward before Boaz could stop me. "We know about the forgery," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "You made one mistake, Marcus. You underestimated the woman in this house." That got his attention, and just for a breath, he faltered. What followed was tense, ugly, fast. Words turned to drawn weapons. But what he didn't count on was the town. Quiet men like Dr. Morrison and Reverend Matthews, hidden among the trees and outbuildings, rising in defense not just of a ranch, but of what was right. A shot cracked the silence. Then another. The world exploded into movement. I don't remember aiming. I just remember the weight of the pistol, the echo of my own heartbeat in my ears, the feel of Boaz's hand reaching for mine when it was over. The law took Blackwood by nightfall. No blood on our doorstep, but truth lay bare and justice riding hard behind it. That night, Boaz and I sat on the porch beneath a blanket of stars, the prairie humming with wind and quiet cattle. He didn't say much. He never did. But when he reached over and took my hand, no formality, no careful restraint, I felt something settle inside me. Not peace, not yet, but permanence, the kind that grows in deep soil. "You didn't have to stay," he said quietly. "I didn't," I replied. "I chose to." And in the hush that followed, I knew he finally understood what we had become. Not a contract, not an arrangement, but a life, messy, hard-won, honest. Love hadn't arrived like a lightning strike. It had taken root like winter wheat, quiet, slow, and strong enough to survive the cold.